Welcome back. We are joined again by Trita Parsi. Sorry, Executive Vice President. Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'll start over and I'll cut.
Okay.
Welcome back. We are joined today by Trita Parsi, the Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. He's also an award-winning author with the Washingtonian magazine for 5 years, named one of the top influential voices on foreign policy in Washington, D.C. I have
Actually 6. I haven't updated my bio yet, but it's 6 years in a row.
6 years in a row. Well done. So again, I would advise everyone to look at the Substack, and the link is in the description. So I really wanted to ask you today about the developments in the Iran war, because today, that is on Saturday, the 13th of June, the Pakistani Prime Minister has argued that a peace deal will be signed within the next 24 hours. I'm not sure if it's well, I'm hoping it's basing it on something, but I'm guessing something is bound to happen this weekend. But first, I must ask, is the Trump administration, though, currently attempting to expel you personally for having, criticized the U.S. approach or engagement in this war?
Glenn, great to be with you again, and thank you for the opportunity to talk about this. I wouldn't go as far as saying it's the Trump administration. There are certain elements within it who I believe, as I don't have full evidence, who have tried to do this. I mean, you have some of these pro-Israeli social media influencers who for weeks have been pushing for this. They even created a AI video of me getting deported, which was the first time I've seen AI recreate my image. So I actually was kind of amused by that. But nevertheless, so there's been this effort from the outside, from some of those elements. And I think there's certain elements inside the government that also have been sympathetic to this and may have tried to push it. But that hit piece that was published against me 2 or 3 nights ago in the Free Press, Bari Weiss's Free Press, it claimed that there was an investigation, but the State Department came out within hours and denied that there was an investigation, which is very unusual. And my own theory as what happened, and it's partly based on conversations we've had, is that there were some elements inside who thought that by getting some external pressure, additional external pressure, this would help move along the bureaucratic effort to actually get an investigation that would lead to a deportation. But the State Department has come out and said that that is not taking place. I don't know if that may change in the future. I don't think these people will give up for a second. But I think what we can say, though, is that this is a long-term trend. You know, for 25 years, I've been fighting the neocons and warmongers in Washington. They've always tried to cancel me, silence me, discredit me, slander me, accuse me of being an Iranian agent and all of these different kind of lies. This is the first moment I see, though, however, they are very publicly trying to escalate it towards a deportation operation. I don't think this round worked out that well for them because there was this massive amount of public support, which was completely organic. At the Quincy Institute, we were still trying to figure out exactly where will this story go, what's going on. We're making phone calls, but it came out of itself that I was quite hardened by it, I have to admit, of course. And I think this frankly backfired because there were also elements inside the administration that pushed back against this. So it's a little bit more complicated than to say that the Trump administration tried it. There's certain elements there that clearly are trying to do it, but others were not in favor.
It is interesting, though, how the discourse around the wars and conflicts have changed. I mean, I often miss the more objective approach by from the likes of Henry Kissinger. Whenever he would write something, he would take himself out of the analysis and just explain, out of the situation, just explain what is happening. And but these days, one uses only these labels. One says, one is pro, well, especially with the Iran war now, the assumption is that if you're pro-Israeli, then you will praise the war. If you're a critic of the attack on Iran, well, then you're pro-Iranian. But it doesn't really make much sense. I mean, it doesn't really matter if you think who you're pro or not, or what you think about Iran. You need if you like Iran or hate Iran, you need an honest analysis of the war, because
Yes, but
this war was a disaster for U.S. strategic interest. So
Absolutely.
this idea that if you just, if you support the US, then you force the war, it doesn't really make much sense if you do an analysis of of how this war would likely work out. And the conclusion is that, yeah, it would be disastrous. But do you get the impression that the discourse is kind of, the quality has dropped significantly?
Well, I would go one step further. It has qualitatively deteriorated remarkably, but it has done so outside of the US as well. And I think that is one of the big differences. I was here in 2003, and it was very clear. I mean, the Bush administration at the time, Karl Rove, was essentially saying that if you're against the war, you're unpatriotic. So it was very much at this level, perhaps not as low as it has become now. But you didn't have that on the European side. You still could have a rational conversation on the European side about the causes of war, about the context, about trying to understand Saddam Hussein's motivations and calculations. Understanding is not to sympathize, explaining is not to defend. It's just to try to better understand so that you yourself can calculate your best options and calibrate your best way forward by having a realistic understanding of what the actual lay of the land is. I've seen that on the European side, particularly after 2022, and the Russian invasion of Ukraine is just completely deteriorated, not just on the issue of Ukraine and Russia, but almost all of the other major conflicts. I see that on Ukraine, on Gaza, and I clearly have seen that on the Iran side as well, in which again news is not about explaining, it's not about facts, it's about essentially sloganeering for your team. And part of the reason why individuals like myself, you, and many of the people that you have on your show end up becoming a problem is that if you want to have a war of choice, you have to get rid of all nuance. You have to get rid of all context. You just have to reduce everything to black and white, good versus evil, and have no one ask any questions. And people who do ask questions, who try to explain the context, who try to explain what the other sides may perceive their situation to be, become obstacles to these wars of choice. And as a result, you have to go after them. You have to chase them out. You have to cancel them, discredit them, accuse them of being sympathetic to the Ayatollah, to Putin, or to Saddam simply by trying to explain, okay, this is how we think they're seeing the situation. And again, this was seen before in the US, and the US is so often in wars, so it's not unusual that that type of a war atmosphere brings the discourse down. But now I'm seeing it in Europe in a way that is frankly terrifying, even on conflicts that they're not directly involved in.
I often make the point that moralism it can be deeply immoral, because I'm always asked, do you condemn Hamas on for what they did on that day? Yeah, sure. Or do you condemn Russia for invading? And it's, and all the arguments, they're always anchored in yeah, condemning someone, or this moralism. But again, what makes it moral if one is forced into a language where one side is all good, the other one is all pure evil, and now that makes it impossible to actually discuss the security concerns of your opponents, undermines the ability to find compromise and peace. When is it? Uh, then the moralism can become deeply immoral, because you no longer have the ability to enhance your own security interest. And this is, yes, as you mentioned the Ukraine war, I've noticed this as well, because when I criticized the toppling of Yanukovych in 2014, I was told, that's pro-Russian argument, and the failure to implement the Minsk agreement. Oh, well, if you criticize this, is also pro-Russian, or if you are against sending weapons or in favor of diplomacy, then well, that's pro-Russian and anti-Ukrainian. And that's kind of where the discourse shuts down. But no one actually explains, how did any of this benefit Ukraine or NATO? I mean, imagine if we could go back to 2014 now, not toppling Yanukovych. The Ukrainians would have all their territory, including Crimea. All their men would still be alive or not having fled the country. The infrastructure would be intact. They could be a formidable bridge between East and West, a buffer. How was this good for us? Now NATO is
Mm.
disintegrating. It doesn't. But we don't take this point of departure. What is good for us, and then you discuss the different approaches. It's always going back to this, pro this or anti that, and
Yeah.
in that concept of being pro Iranian or pro Russian, or it's just a concept which nobody likes, and then they fill it up with any content they want. It's
Yeah.
very, it's
And
manipulative.
and ultimately terribly, terribly counterproductive. Just look at how Europe is faring right now. Look at how the United States is faring right now. I had conversations with the administration before the war. I argued ferociously that they are completely misreading Iran. They're thinking that Iran is much weaker than it is. And beyond that, they think that the Iranians fear war more than they fear surrender. And as a result, Trump's approach was to just amass more military towards the region and think that eventually the Iranians would surrender. And as a result, he would never actually have to actualize his bluff of attacking. And I was trying to make it clear to them that you don't understand. They will never surrender. They fear surrender far more than they fear war. They think they can survive war, perhaps even come out looking good from a war, but they can never survive a surrender. And as a result, the entire fundamentals of your approach is erroneous. And I think that was proven right, that the Iranians did not flinch. They, in fact, seem to have thought that some level of war was necessary to correct Trump's perception of Iran's weakness, false perception of Iran's weakness, and then go to the negotiating table from a position in which Trump had understood that they're not as weak as he thought. In fact, they're quite strong. And as a result, he's going to have to agree to a compromise rather than to Iran just essentially accepting America's terms for surrender, which is exactly where we are right now. If there is an MOU, whether it is more beneficial to Iran or the US, there's going to be a long debate about it. But we're no longer talking about in any way, shape, or form the terms of surrender that Trump had in mind on February 28th. All of them are out the window. And it is because of this miscalculation. It is because of this misperception. And because of at the end of the day, the debate has never really been allowed for the last decades to be nuanced on Iran. Iran is similar to the case of Israel-Palestine. It's been going on for so long. And this has been a deeply felt issue in the United States, going back to the hostage crisis. It's always been extremely difficult to have a nuanced conversation about Iran in the United States, much, much more so than it ever has been in Europe. But ultimately, it has been clearly to the detriment of the US itself, because when you have incomplete information or wishful thinking, you will make wrong policy decisions, and those wrong policy decisions will end up costing you far more than the other side.
Yeah, that's written in Machiavelli's work. That is, well, men see the world as they wish it was, and then they die, or then they're destroyed essentially. But no, but they're seeing the world as you wish it was, and I think this is a key problem in Europe. Though everything is in this part of the world is very normative. Every argument is normative. So if you're saying, well, if you're saying that the Russians are winning, then then you're supporting the Russians, because if you're saying they're winning, then you might. This
You're
might
rooting for them.
reduce public support for financing the war. So everything is nothing is a reflection of reality. It's just normative. How
And can I add one thing to that?
Yeah.
If you actually had a war that was seen deeply as justified by the population, you would not need to do any of these things. It is precisely when it is either a war of choice, or in the case of Ukraine, an option not to actually have a real negotiation, because that's from the outset we've seen that there's just been this rejection of negotiation, an effort to think that the war can set back the Russians 10, 15, 20 years, and that will give Europe another generation of peace, as one European official called me, essentially arguing very ferociously that this is an opportunity to set back the Russians, and as a result, diplomacy is not needed. When you have situations like this, that's when you really need to clamp down on the debate. Because if there was a strong level of support, for instance, if the United States had been invaded by another country, I don't think there would be any need for a clampdown of the debate, because there would have been a genuine desire to expel the invaders and support for what would be a defensive war. These type of things only come in when you're going in the direction of some variation of the war of choice. And this is also why there's such a low self-confidence in the government in being able to have just a reasonable conversation about this. If they had the deep support of the population, which they would have if it was a defensive war fully, then there would be no need for them to have this lack of confidence.
Yeah. Well, before the attack on Iran in February, I was making the point that Iran is quite powerful, but this was considered to be a pro-Iranian argument.
Yeah.
I said that they have a significant support among their own population, that is the government. This is also considered to be a statement of support. And also, I made the point that this is an existential threat for Iran, which is also dismissed because they said, "Oh, we just want to help protesters." But if you could accept this, what I consider to be realities, you could predict how the Iranians will behave. That is, if it's an existential threat, they will absorb a lot of pain, and they will be able to fight. And again, they are quite powerful, and once you kill a leader, it's not as if the people will rush to the street and topple the government. All of this was very flawed, and also if they would recognize this was an existential threat to Iran, it would have been predictable that they would have gone up that escalation ladder. Unlike in June, they would have done it in February. That is to shut down the Strait of Hormuz, strike all the U.S. bases in the region. All of this could have been predicted if, you know, ex reality wouldn't be considered treasonous. But
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Right.
but
I was in several different meetings with folks with government or outside of government prior to this, in which there was discussions about what the Iranians would do and options that existed and things, pathways that could have been pursued. And I do have to say, I do think that there were elements in the intelligence community that was trying to get the right intelligence to the president, and he was dismissive of it and was choosing to listen to the Israelis. But I can tell you that at least from what I saw, there was plenty of people in the U.S. government that was completely dismissive of the idea that the Iranians would close the Straits of Hormuz, or that they would be attacking the other GCC countries. And I had to really emphasize, all of these options, yes, it is true. They have not exercised them before. And in the past, they were very polite in their attacks and their responses because they wanted to de-escalate. But this time around, they will see it as escalatory. So you have to take into account the striking possibility that they will do this. And it was dismissed, or it was viewed with significant skepticism. So I think we should not belittle how much the drinking of Kool-Aid and groupthink, how quickly that can set in when you're not allowing not just one or two voices, but a critical mass of critical voices to always be present in conversations.
yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. And on this, so I remember on this podcast in the weeks and months before the attack, I had often a common guest would be Professor Marandi, who for in Tehran, who's got a good finger on the pulse in terms of what the government is thinking, and he was just stating as common sense. Well, of course, if in the past we didn't want to escalate because that might draw the Americans in, but if the Americans gonna join, they're gonna attack, and then the purpose will be regime change, and there is no government in the rear to take over. That means we're going to be a new Syria, a new Libya. It's going to be a destruction of a key central power, which the US would see as an obstruction. So of course, on the first day, we're going to have to shut down the Strait of Hormuz, go after all the bases, essentially outlining the whole logic. It makes a lot of sense. But still, I heard, Trump give a speech. No one could have predicted this, like, why would they take the bases? Like, it's just, it's quite remarkable. But yeah, well,
And it's similar to the Iraq war, who knew that there was Sunnis and Shias in Iraq? Who knew that there would be an insurgency? I mean, it's absolutely stunning to see the level of miscalculation that can happen in extremely sophisticated governments and bureaucracies. Now, not necessarily currently in the United States, but at least under the Bush administration, a lot of the policy processes were still very, very functional. But it's just amazing how quickly they can be reduced to something far less sophisticated if you do not allow for a plethora of evidence and opinions to be included in the process.
yeah. Well, it's also then um, when everyone goes into war, it's always also the discussion about the morality of it. That's usually how they shame people away. That is somehow it's always the people who are cheering for war who has the moral argument. There's always, oh, what about the girls in Iran? We want to liberate them. Or what about girls going to school in Afghanistan? And it's always this moral arguments. And first of all, I think they're very deceptive. But even if all of this would be genuine, one also has to look at strategy. How do you think you're going to achieve what you set out to achieve? Because if you look at our track records over the past 30 years now, it hasn't been great. I mean, 20 years in Afghanistan to replace the Taliban with the Taliban, all this money and lives wasted in Iraq, only to essentially, make it into closer to an Iranian ally. The attack on Libya, which essentially brought back slavery, and attack on Syria, which has now made us allied with ISIS through Jalani. I mean, this is not a great track record. If it's just I wish there would be more, substantial arguments or discussions in terms of strategy. What exactly do we want to achieve, and how can this be achieved? And we don't seem to do that.
Yeah.
But
And by the way, your comment about the immoral aspect of moralism is really well taken. It's for a reason I've always been more attracted to realism, because it takes that dimension out of it. It assumes that all actors at the end of the day are pursuing some definition of their own self-interest. And by trying to understand how they define their self-interest, you have a better way of predicting what their next steps will be. And if you can do that, you will have a better way of dealing with them, defeating them if you need to. But you need to understand how they see the world in order to be able to do so. And moralism only makes that all the more difficult, because you are confusing yourself from how they actually see the world, because you think that there's some sort of single moral truth that guides these things, rather than the actions of decision makers based on flawed, perhaps, but nevertheless, their calculation of what their self-interest is. And if you can understand that, you can predict them. Moralism gives you almost no predictive value at all.
it's also in great power politics. So states usually sell, you want to sell war as peace. You want to, this is it's not a new phenomenon. This is a core political propaganda. And when it came to the Afghanistan war, we learned from was it WikiLeaks? They leaked these documents from the CIA, which showed that the Europeans were losing a little bit of support for the occupation of Afghanistan. So they essentially concluded that the Europeans cared a lot about women's rights. So let's frame the war as, we're occupying Afghanistan for these 20 years to help little girls go to school. I mean, it's quite absurd that we think this is why great powers go to war. This is why occupy. I mean, this is not about America. It's any country. It is a bit. It's a little bit childish. I mean, this is it's absurd that the U.S. suddenly became Amnesty International with nuclear weapons. But after this point, though, you had articles coming out. I think it was in the Guardian. You had a NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg and Angelina Jolie co-authoring an article together. A little bit of NATO, a bit of Hollywood, about why NATO is now the leading provider of women's rights. It's just it's extraordinary, and people, they eat it up. And then if you oppose the wars, then I guess you don't care about little girls. I mean, this is where the moralism comes in, and at the end we fool ourselves, because we can't discuss the motivation for war. We can't discuss the strategic aspects of it. It's
if I could go on a small tangent here, it is relative to the attacks that I've been enduring from the neocons. And I think I did mention that part of this, at least on the Substack post this morning. When we started the National Iranian-American Council, this is like 25 years ago. At first, it was not even supposed to be involved in politics. We were just trying to get the Iranian-American community to become a little bit more sophisticated in understanding and participating in the American democracy. And this was done because the first community that was targeted after 9/11 was the Iranian-American community. The Enhanced Border Security Act was passed immediately after 9/11, and it restricted visas to Iranians. Did nothing about Saudis and Egyptians and others who actually were part of the 9/11 attacks. And it was a very clear manifestation that if you don't have any political representation, you end up getting the shorter end of the stick all the time, even if this had nothing to do with the Iranians or the Iranian government even. But over time, because the conversation in Washington was increasingly going the direction that they would, should we attack Iran? Should we not attack Iran? We had pressure from our own membership to start taking positions on these matters, and we eventually did. And we realized that we were a very small organization, a relatively small community, but we thought there's one thing we may be able to achieve, and that is to make sure that unlike in the Iraq War, in which the neocons paraded their favorite Iraqi Americans on TV, left and right, begging for the United States to bomb their ancestral home, that at a minimum, we can make sure that if there is a war, at least the American public will know it was not because of the Iranian-American community. That our voice would be clear on this issue. We may not be able to prevent the war, but we will be able to prevent exactly the argument that you said, that this is some sort of a moral favor to the people inside of Iran. And by having Iranian Americans oppose the war, we would take that argument away from the neocons. And that was part of the reason why the neocons came after us, and many different things that we did that were countering their agenda. And I have to say, for 20 or so years, we were very successful. It was very clear that the Iranian American community, the majority of it favored diplomacy, an overwhelming majority favored the JCPOA, strongly opposed the Iranian government and its repression, but nevertheless wanted to pursue a peaceful path between the US and Iran, lifting sanctions, etc. But it's not until just in the last year that the neocons managed to pull off something that I have to say, frankly, I was surprised by, which was to, in a variety of ways, over a course of time, they had worked very hard and they had cultivated alliances with the monarchist Iranians to really get them to become extremely pro-Israel and then ultimately pro-war. And in some ways, at least in the early phases of this, become the face of that war, with some of them dancing and singing in the streets, celebrating the start of the war. That was a key thing that we had frankly managed to prevent for 20 years. And plenty of studies need to be made on better understanding exactly how was that flipped. I have some theories, I've written some pieces about it, but it's still much more that needs to be done to fully understand, because it is a remarkable shift of psychology of not a majority, they were never a majority, but nevertheless a very significant minority that went to that side. A lot of it has to do, of course, with that the repression in Iran became worse and worse. But a lot of it has all to do with the fact that these elements also were trying to eliminate all other voices and all other pathways. Reform was wrong, lifting sanctions was wrong, dialogue was wrong, and essentially saying all of those things have failed. The only thing that is left is war and foreign military intervention, which meant they had to do exactly the type of cancel culture that we just talked about earlier. They had to discredit everyone who favored diplomacy, everyone who favored lifting of sanctions, opposed war, in order to be able to create an atmosphere and a landscape in which they were seen as the only remaining option. That's how they sell the war. Everything else has failed, so war is the only option. Now, of course, the war has gone disastrously. I don't see them singing and dancing in the streets in the same way any longer, but it was ultimately, I have to say, a failure for the Iranian-American community as a whole, that a minority of them could have been recruited and pushed in this direction, ending up becoming, in my view, a very repulsive face of this war by singing and dancing in the streets as their own countrymen and women were being bombed.